with the Falcon mission, and that he's got the obelisk behind him. He's the world savior. He's the avatar of Mars, as much as the Pope is the avatar of Apollo or Osiris. So let's go ahead and get into this really briefly here. I'll get more detailed into it here in a minute when we get into the Thelema. But the way that the occultists describe it is that we are in the age of Horus. We just transitioned out of the age of Osiris. And this is from the teachings of Thelema. And I'll get into this soon. But essentially, there's this idea that there are periods of time where there's a dominant influence in the world. And that it says right now, the aeon of Osiris dominated by a paternal principle and the formula of the dying god, self-sacrifice, submission to a father god. So the modern age, or the aeon of Horus, is dominated by the principle of the child, the androgen, individuality. And this is the new age that we're transitioning into. And of course, Horus being Mars, and there are certain things that means. And so in other words, it's a fundamental shift from patriarchal to the child, which represents new. It represents as in new, as in no past, no baggage. Revolutionary, as in starting from scratch. And also androgen, meaning that it's not patriarchy, it's going to be something different. But these are some of the characteristics of this coming age. So let's say the world does end. We do go to Mars with Musk and his ark. This is what the Pope really means. You know, he's the incarnate of this deity. So Musk sends the ark to Mars to save humanity. Well, the ark is actually a rocket. It's called the Starship now, which of course is named after Star Trek. This is what your ark looks like. And what's more, they even found on Mars, they actually found the emblem of Star Trek. The Star Trek logo is on Mars. It's a big plateau, size of Florida or something. Again, I'm just showing you this because this is a pattern. They have been using science fiction to prepare you for the new age, for this new paradigm. Science fiction is the mythology. It's the mythos of the day. It's the foundational myths. It even has the etchings. I mean, that's a very close approximation. Anyway, here's your starship to Mars. Of course, starship, astral travel, that's all thelemic, which we'll get into. Okay, so Elon Musk is sending the obelisk, which is, of course, a symbol of the male god and the seed. You know, the human beings in the capsule, that's the seed. So the seed of humanity to the new world. The obelisk represents the sun god savior in the flesh. Now, this is what I wrote a couple years ago, and I think I've been vindicated. I said, they may precipitate actual climate catastrophe in order to, corral this operation. So let's move on. A couple other things I found to be quite interesting. So it turns out that there was a Martian pope before, Constantine. So Constantine, and this is in the Catholic Encyclopedia, his coins had representations of Mars. While professing to be a Christian, he believed in sun worship magic formula for the protection of crops and the healing of disease. Constantine is known for this transition of the tenant farmers into serfs, and that's what Pope Elon is doing, where you have capitalists, like the people in the boat on Wall-E. We're fat, we're lazy, everything's been made easy, as much as we can. We try to make things streamlined and easy. We try to reduce the amount of labor we have to do. We're not really connected to much of the things that sustain us. We don't have to hunt our own food or grow our own food. So how would you convert people into just farming for a living? How would you get people to give up private property and even live as serfs? Well, it's going to be really hard, especially if they're armed. So you do have this agenda of disarmament, which is pretty obvious, but it doesn't seem like that's going to actually work. So one way that they can accomplish the disarmament is by converting people into a new lifestyle where that's no longer even a need. You don't have any property to defend. So what he's doing, though, or what has been done with the space program, is they have pitched this idea of a perfect society, a utopia. Now, the word utopia means no place, and it always has meant total state planning, a perfect state. If you just get the right technocrats to write all the rules, you can have a perfect society. If you have the right Bible, the right holy book, everything will be perfect, but everybody has to obey it. I mean, this is the idea of utopia, uniformity, universality. And the space program is a utopian endeavor. It's meant to get us all in the same sheet. We're all part of the same cult of the obelisk. And just to show you how well they're succeeding in this objective of converting everybody to the same religion, there's a long tradition of burning obelisks in Iran. Well, actually stoning, because they've always recognized that the obelisk was a symbol, to them a symbol of the devil, a symbol of evil. They knew what it was. So they rejected this symbol. And you can find it in various parts of the world, like in Iran, where they throw rocks traditionally at these things. Well, now they're starting to burn them. So for the past, it's been burning obelisks. Let's see if I can find, there's an organization, but they started this about 2013. Oftentimes they'll put dollar signs, they'll put the symbol of Israel, they'll put USA, and they'll torch these things. And that's, again, it's because they're rejecting Baal. And it says here, the devil column. And this is from one of the instigators behind this. The important fact is the antiquity of this symbol. This symbol was named obelisk, but it was named Baal. The Holy Quran, Surah verse 125, quote, "Do you call upon Baal and leave the Creator?" Here it is clear they have an idol known as Baal or Baal, which they prostrate in front of. So if you did a duck and cover drill as a kid, you were prostrating before this god, before the obelisk. If you were worried about getting nuked on Christmas because of Kim Jong-un's threats, you were prostrating yourself before Baal. If you were cheering during this last SpaceX rocket launch when they were sending genetically modified mice to space, you were worshiping Baal. So again, this is widely known out in Iran, this devil column, which traditionally they threw rocks at, but when that started to become off limits, they started spontaneously burning these things in the streets. Now, I say this because Iran has a space program now. So even though they may culturally reject the symbol, they think they've got it. They think okay, we rejected it, we're burning it, we're not going to accept this symbol of Baal into our midst. Well, no, it's just like every other nation of the world, they're all part of the same universal church. Iran's new space program, they've been in it for about almost 10 years now. So it doesn't matter if they're throwing rocks at the obelisk and saying that they reject the devil, they reject, Baal. Well, look, you've just accepted his symbol. Your government has a space program that is more or less aligning you with this symbol. And then what's more, the heaven that it promises is the universal heaven. So you're part of this program. And that's what's the genius of it, is that as long as you're a heliocentrist, you can be a Catholic, a Muslim, a Jew, an atheist, or a Scientologist. You can be any number of religions, or you could even be a non-theist. But if you still believe in outer space, you still believe in heaven. So I want to contrast a couple of things for you. So if you look at St. Peter's Square, where you have that obelisk that the Vicar of Christ, the Pope, genuflects before 3 times per day. If you take a look at it from above, it is identical. The obelisk in the circle it is more or less identical to this, the obelisk in a circle. Look at the rocket launch pads, SpaceX, NASA, Blue Origin, or look at any of the Burning Man festivals. In fact, let me show you one of these. So the Burning Man festival often arranges itself in the same way, where from above you will see this central pillar and then the ring around it. Or you look at the Washington Monument from above, and it's surrounded by a circle of flags. And of course, that circle that surrounds it, it's symbolic, of course, of the same thing. The circle represents the goddess. The pillar represents the male. The point in the circle, like the symbol for Target, where you get your clothes or whatever, that's the same symbol. Now, again, the reason why this is important is that this is the symbol of the Savior from the world. So the world Savior's symbol, because he's the Savior, he's the one who gives new life and is a symbol of eternal life. The Savior of the world is also a rocket, as I was saying, because Elon Musk is a world savior because he can take you away from this place. And again, they're creating a perfect vision of a perfect society that requires that you leave behind things of the world. And this, again, is what the communists wanted to do. How do we get the capitalists to abandon their property? It's not going to be easy, since the property elevates and improves their lifestyle. Well, you make them feel guilty about their lifestyle. You introduce a new concept of sin. Since they no longer feel sin and guilt, you can introduce it in a new way. Oh, look, you're using an internal combustion engine. By the way, the polar bears are drowning, and it's your fault. It's always implied. Okay, so I've been making this correlation, though, between Elon Musk and this Martian Pope Constantine, just because Constantine did represent transitioning people into slavery. And every person who goes into space is going into slavery. If you understand that going into an enclosed system with a uniform, with no freedom of movement, mobility, with no property, is tantamount to slavery, especially if it's a collectivist work farm. It's a labor camp. Now, Constantine's cross, it was, they often refer to his cross as having been infused into a sword or a symbolic sword. And the space X looks like a sword, or the cross of Constantine. And Mars, of course, is a god of war. Falcon 9 is Horus, the Egyptian counterpart to the war god. Now, there is this TED Talk, The Future According to Elon Musk and the Pope. Space communism. And this is the next part I want to get into, communism. Because communism isn't a new thing. This idea of collectivism, total state, a slave state, it's nothing new. It's just been rebranded and it's given a new rationale. Like in this case, it's to save the planet. Previously, it was to save the oppressed workers from the rich. But even in this case, it's a way of consolidating wealth. It's a way of destroying independent wealth. Space communism, it's not a new concept. Utopian schemes have always promised a pie in the sky. So you have the Christian heaven, you live forever. You have the Muslim heaven, live forever, you get the virgins. You have various concepts of this perfected reality. The communists promised a worker's paradise. And what these things all have in common is that to achieve the paradise, you have to sacrifice the now. You have to destroy what you have and start from scratch. You have to have uniformity. You can't have non-believers. That's one of the common themes here. Until you convert or kill and you have universality, you won't have perfection. And of course, perfection and the perfectibility of man is the basic utopian idea that you could have a perfect way. And on Mars, it's going to be perfect, self-sustaining. There's a TV show called The Orville, which is worth looking at, as all science fiction is, as a way of predicting what's coming next. And The Orville is a satirical take on Star Trek, but it contains various storylines that, it's constantly preaching to people about the perfect way of life. And so in this case, there's an episode where they're describing this lost colony. So it's a spacefaring colony. They went into an asteroid. They hollowed it out. They moved inside of it. They recycled all their oxygen, all their water, and everything else. So they created a perfectly sustainable environment and ecosystem within this space rock. And of course, they were moving towards this exoplanet several light years away. So it was going to be a multi-generational trip. And since it's multi-generational, they don't want any one disease to wipe anybody else out. They made sure to have racial diversity, racial quota. And of course, why would you have that? Well, you don't want any one nationality or any one set of traditions to compete with a new paradigm. It's the same reason why communists are against the old traditions by attacking the nuclear family to make sure that there's no influence of people who remembered what it was like before. They want this is the age of Horus, so it's the crowned and conquering child. They want the blank slate. So they want to destroy your collective identities that don't identify with the state. So they want your collective identity to be that of the commune. So here you have a racially diverse group. And again, this is quotas, and it's on purpose. It's statism at its finest. So in the course of their trip, and this is being discussed on the Orville, they forget that they're going to an exoplanet. These people living inside of a hollowed out asteroid have so perfected their world that they kind of forget several generations pass by and they're like, wait, why did we start off in this direction? And they just didn't even bother. In other words, it became a new world, self-sustaining. So they lived in a hollowed out planetoid and soon forgot their original creation stories. And this was said to be like this, some type of an ideal. Like, look, they did it right. They created a perfect system, a living spaceship. And of course, this is all meant to tie into the concept of the Earth as spaceship Earth, which is a term that the Scientologists use, but you also hear it throughout NASA. And the idea is that the Earth itself is a spaceship. It's an enclosed system. And the idea of an enclosed system is very important here as well, because what that means is everything that goes in to the system, rather everything that is inside the system, rather, is all there will ever be. Like, you're not going to have any more land. You're not going to have any more of anything. So you got to make it sustainable. Otherwise, of course, if we don't clamp down on our consumption, we will bring about the world's destruction. And that's the reason why they brought you the picture of the entire Earth in itself originally. There was this thing called the Whole Earth movement back in the 60s where you had these people saying, Stuart Brand was behind it, and he said, show us the whole Earth to NASA. That was his big challenge. And the reason why is they believe that until we see the Earth in its entirety, we're not going to see it as the fragile, enclosed system that it is, and we won't be inclined to protect it. So this was designed to make us conscious of our environment, showing us the face of our God. And of course, the fragility of it. Okay, so now we're getting into this part here. So communism, what is it? Is it really a perfected way of life? Does any one religion or ideology really have the formula for a perfect system? Of course not. But that's always been the type of language you hear from revolutionaries. The perfectibility of man is the idea that you can perfect man through perfecting his institutions. That if we just had the right people in charge, and that's where the technocrats come in. They're the right people in charge. But communism, of course, is just a bait and switch. It's a ploy used by the oligarchs to keep the poor poor and to keep the upwardly mobile from climbing too high. So here you have how the Soviets imagined communist life in space. Artists from the Soviet Union didn't just imagine a workers' utopia on Earth, they also thought that their great communist experiment would reach other worlds. So here's a conceptual design from 1965. It's like Jetsons. It looks fun, right? At least that's how they've sold it to you. If you watch anything about space, it's always fun for the most part. The Jetsons, everything's convenient, everything's easy, it's a wonderland. Until you realize that this is actually just a gulag, and your spacesuit is just a uniform. The poster, "We Want You," or "I Want You," with Uncle Sam? Well, NASA has repackaged that idea as "We Want You," which is collectivist. We want you for Mars. And what you have here are examples of actual posters produced by NASA they look Stalinist to me. So we need you, and here you have the new ideal citizen. And what you have is a faceless individual. This is a person who has said, "I've heard the call." We, of course, is the collective. To be a part of the we, you have to let go of your I. You have no face anymore. Now you're wearing a uniform. Now everybody looks the same. Now everybody's equal. And again, the Mars Explorers Wanted posters, to me, all look like communist posters, which is they idealize it. They idealize the work of, or the life of workers, quote unquote. The new colony civilization of the next generation. Welcome to Mars. Mars Explorers Wanted. There are other posters that say we need, here we go, farmers wanted. Like, how many of you are familiar with this communist propaganda? I'll show you an example. The idea of workers of the world unite, of the world uniting underneath one particular system, so we can be saved from the collectively from the oppression of the rich. If you look at this type of imagery, it tends to glorify, quote, the people. It's heroic. It's dramatic. If you look at these workers, they look like heroes. Like, really, I mean, look, they look strong, competent. They can fix the world. And look, May 1st, May Day, which is the major pagan holiday, of all the holidays that the pagans celebrate. People recognize, Christmas or Halloween, but really it's May Day is it, with the maypole. But May 1st is a major communist holiday, and we'll get into that as well. So, for example, the Communist Manifesto, Little Red Books, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to show you how that picture there looks very similar to the type of idealized workers that they're showing you with this NASA come to Mars propaganda. Again, they're trying to glorify the work of a serf. And what is a serf? A serf is someone who is confined to a plot of land for life. You can't leave. Well, where are you going to go on Mars? You're under a dome. And even if you do leave, how long will the batteries work on your spacesuit, which is like a ball and chain? It is a form of slavery by any other name. So to recap this thing, you have this idea that the only way to the heavenly realms, which today is outer space, where the gods are, and of course today the gods are the planets, named after the planets, is through the ones with the keys to the higher realms, the ones who sell you on the vision of what heaven is like. And they use images and beautiful poetic descriptions. And if you look at the imagery of NASA, look at Carl Sagan, look at all the old Nova specials, the stuff you saw in school, it's meant to be awe-inspiring. Like the feeling that you got when you watched Space Odyssey 2001, these are meant to be religious experiences. And they really are. So the priests who travel to the heaven, the priesthoods who worship at the obelisk and in these churches, they've been replaced by the astronauts who travel to the higher realms with the obelisk. And even the idea that the high priests are in a hermetically sealed temple. The space station is hermetically sealed. Of course, hermit, the idea of the hermit or the hermetically sealed group of people, it's like a monastery, more or less. But in that case, it's literally sealed because it's a pressurized cabin. This is the Pope's tiara and the keys to heaven and the keys to earth, or the keys to the kingdom. The idea of I am the way, the only way through this or out of this world. The only way to be saved, of course, is through these saviors, the papacy, the Martian papacy, as Werner von Braun described it. Okay, so we're going to take a short 10-minute break here. So now we're on part 3. I want to go over the symbolism of SpaceX and Blue Origin, which we discussed a bit of that. Specifically, SpaceX definitely is part of this fertility rite allegory, and phonetically, space sex is accurate. Space is heaven, and it's the consummation or the conjugal visit between the God below and the God above, the earth god and the night sky goddess. That would be the space sex. Space, of course, is heaven. And heaven sex and sex magic are a couple of the topics we're going to get into here. And that's what I learned with the Thelemic cult. The idea of mystification of the process of reincarnation and, of course, the process of conception, which we will touch on that. This here clearly demonstrates what we're talking about. Now, whatever you think about the space program, you cannot deny the symbolism here, the iconography. The burning obelisk is significant here. I pointed out earlier to the catharsis at the mall in DC, which they do every May, which corresponds to May Day and the Maypole, same fertility rite. But the burning obelisk is what the rocket launch actually is. That's a lot of the drama. And this ties into the idea of the phoenix, the dying and resurrecting being, but also the burning of the obelisk is referencing the actual concept, the actual conjugal visit, the merging of the two. So it's all pretty much a fertility rite. This is the God coming back to life. This is the moment, like I mentioned earlier, how the character of Osiris being reassembled and then fixed with the obelisk, and then, of course, the goddess of the night sky gives him life. It's been retold in the story of Frankenstein's monster, assembled from the grave and given life through this charge from above with the lightning rod, which merges the earth god or the earth with the sky, bringing him life. Well, the moment you pull the rod or pull the lever down and it's alive, well, that's the moment that they launch the rocket. Now, there's something I'm going to talk about later, but the countdown itself to the launch is, in a way, it's a very symbolic thing. And there's this TV show out, which I'm going to discuss later, and it has to do with Jack Parsons. And in that movie, there's actually a scene where they have a countdown to a rocket takeoff. And while that's happening, there is a ritual going on at the lodge. And they make it very clear in this TV show that the occult society behind Jack Parsons, and here's the book Strange Angel, the Otherworldly Life of rocket scientist Jack Whiteside Parsons, that it was more than just some guy experiencing a bit of madness with his science. It's not just genius and madness, but that there is a correlation between the actual ceremony of the rocket launch and the rites that they practice. And that's what we've been talking about here. This ancient religion grafted onto our modern world. And again, this is the catharsis at the mall, a lesser known Burning Man festival in front of the obelisk. And of course, this what I'm saying here is that the Burning Man, also symbolized by the phoenix, is what you see when the obelisk is burning. The Burning Man is Osiris. He's coming to life, and that's what the fire means. The fire is the symbol of life, the resurrection. And that's why you see so many of these ceremonies on the solstices and such celebrated with fire and flame, the symbols of the flame of the torch. Okay, so then here's another one for you. This is Jeff Bezos at the site of his Blue Origin launch. And of course, Blue Origin, another reference to the elite, the blue bloods. And he is busting open a champagne bottle with everyone else watching and cheering. And so my contention is that this, of course, is a pretty obvious reference to the obelisk and what it actually means. Okay, now this next picture I'm going to show you is the trajectory of your typical SpaceX launch. So it goes up and it goes into the night sky, and then you have its fairing separation and then its payload separation. Well, the payload being dropped off is actually representing then the sun god and the goddess, and of course the impregnation or the conception. In fact, and I'll be mentioning this later on today. In fact, I'll mention it now. Last year in May, there was that Burning Man, a 33-year-old who set himself on fire in front of the White House with a USA shirt, which was already kind of interesting considering how close it was to this Burning Man festival at the same location, for all intents and purposes. But this year was the 33rd year of the Burning Man festival. So they've had 33 of those. And on this year, I'm talking about 2019, last summer actually, during last summer's Burning Man festival, a 33-year-old man died. Just sort of unexplained death. And at the same time, that weekend, that Labor Day weekend, 33 people burned to death in a boat. And this boat was called Conception. Coast Guard officials have recovered the bodies of 33 people who died in a massive fire aboard the Conception off the coast of Santa Cruz, or cross. There's that cross symbol. Cross, think of Jesus, 33. Jesus died at 33. This was the same weekend as the Burning Man festival. Burning Man is the phoenix, dying and resurrecting God, also Christ or Osiris. And of course, the burning obelisk represents the conception. This boat was called the Conception. Now, having looked at this closely, I don't believe it was a real death scene. I think this is all very symbolic, and believe it or not, the tickets were $666, which is another number heavily associated with the sun god. And I think in the reports, they might have changed it to 665 and some change, but look, bodies of 33 victims. And when they broke the story, 3:30 a.m. is when the fire broke out. These are not coincidences. The Conception, operated by Truth Aquatics out of Santa Barbara, was on a $665 per person Labor Day driving excursion. Again, this happened the same weekend as the 33rd Burning Man Festival, where a 33-year-old died. And of course, in front of the White House, near the obelisk, was a 33-year-old guy burning himself, and it was filmed by TMZ. Now, TMZ, phonetically, you could say is Tammuz or Tammuz, which is the Babylonian version of Christ. Okay, so we're talking about Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos. Now, these characters may or may not be, real individuals in the sense of I think of them as actors more or less. Jeff Crazy Eye Bezos, he is characterized by this crazy eye. The reason I draw attention to it is that the symbol of the sun god or Horus, it's often associated with this emphasis on one eye. And this is a little tangent I'm going to go into for a little bit here, but they don't know who his father is. He just turned up in New Mexico, which I find very peculiar. And there's some subtext here to this guy and his whole act, even the name Jeff Bezos. There may be some symbolism there. For example, J and B are the initials of the Masonic pillars. So you can't really overlook that, how much of this is just purely symbolic. But what's more is his origins in New Mexico and Blue Origin. What does that mean? So I think there's a story here. Here he is winking, always emphasizing that eye. But what I actually think is the case, there's another there's like another storyline that goes along with NASA, and it has to do with how the pop culture also sells people on this story. So for example, you all may know the first music video in space was performed by Chris Hadfield, and it was a David Bowie song. Well, David Bowie, the musical artist, released his song Space Odyssey right before the moon Apollo missions. And you can find some interesting parallels between this character that David Bowie played, the man who fell to Earth, and Jeff Bezos, strangely enough. So the man who fell to Earth is about this alien from Mars who shows up on Earth by crash landing in New Mexico. And then he becomes very wealthy by behind the scenes. He's giving trade secrets and technologies to some individual who can capitalize on it. But Jeff Bezos, Crazy Eye Jeff Bezos, of course, New Mexico, unknown origins. For all intents and purposes, he landed on a flying saucer. So it's kind of like the man who fell to Earth. And it goes a little deeper. So here's David Bowie, also characterized with a very crazy eye. And of course, the first music video in space was a David Bowie song. And then we have this character I talked about earlier, Starman. Starman, of course, maybe it means something. Anagram, Mr. Satan. Satan, I saw Satan fall to the earth like lightning. But this idea of David Bowie playing this character who fell to earth. And this character returns to where he came from. The year David Bowie died, he released an album called Black Star. In Black Star, he has a song called Lazarus. And there was a Broadway play for The Man Who Fell to Earth, and there was a Broadway play for Lazarus. Now, Lazarus is another Osiris-type character who dies and then raises from the dead. So here you have David Bowie, right before he dies, releases this project called Lazarus, and it's the character of the man who fell to Earth returning to where he came from, as in going back to Mars. So then, of course, he dies, exits the world stage, but his character goes back to Mars. And then, of course, you have the Tesla Roadster, and when it goes to Mars, it's playing a David Bowie song on an infinite loop. So this is just one example of somebody in pop culture who kind of parallels this space narrative or the space metascript. And in many ways, what he's doing, in a way, kind of echoes this Jeff Bezos character who fell to Earth in New Mexico and is trying to find a way to get us all back to Mars. And of course, the eye thing could be purely symbolic, but I very much doubt it at this point. It's one of the symbols of SpaceX worth looking at is just Jeff Bezos himself. And of course, the Masonic pillars. I'm going to bring this up really quick because There are two pillars in the lodge, one black, one white. This is where you get the floors, the black and the white. And as you can see here, the B and the J on the pillars themselves are the initials of the names. Each of these pillars has a name. So it's Boaz and Jacob, B and J. And it represents this duality, which we see played out quite a lot. This is the basic, the black and the white. That's what the checkers mean. But anytime I see those initials, I always, it's worth looking at. Like Elon, his name, out of the Mars project. So this Bezos character, it's probably more sensible to look at him as a character or a construct more than an actual businessman who created these rockets who can take us to heaven. And again, as far as the rocket goes, the capsule, very significant. When the pyramid is constructed, the top or the capstone of the pyramid is always made of some special stone or gold. Okay, now these three individuals, these are the three astronauts who died on the launch pad. This is one of the early, not the first ones. There was actually, before this, there were some, we're looking at symbolic deaths with NASA, but I wanted to show this to you really quick. As you can see here, they're praying at the capsule. I mean, whether that's a joke or not, but they burned on January 27th, 1967 on the launch pad. And of course, this is the capsule that they ride in. And I'm contending that these deaths within NASA are all just highly symbolic, which I'll get into after that. The next part I want to get into is this, though. This is where I want to start. We'll start with foundational sacrifices. So these three guys burned 1967, and it was on the launch pad. And here's what I think happened. Because the dates, it was January 27th, 1967, 3 astronauts die in a launch pad fire. Now think of the symbolism of the phoenix and the rites of Osiris and the fact that you just saw these guys praying at the tip of the obelisk. So January 27, 1967, 3 astronauts died. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. A flash fire engulfed their command module during the testing for the Apollo Saturn mission. These were the first to die in a spacecraft. Okay, so the date, January 27th, 1967, is significant because this date was the anniversary of the death of Francis Drake. Now, Francis Drake was the first to, I guess, led an expedition, did a complete circumnavigation. But I think the thing about him is that he was an explorer. And he was all about going to the edge or going to the frontier. So the idea of exploring the new frontiers, here you had this early explorer went, as far as he could or whatever, and he dies during one of his expeditions. Sir Francis Drake. But now his death was that same date. It was January 27th. It was a death at sea, doing what he was born to do. So anyway, worth noting that Sir Francis Drake's death date corresponded to the death date of these astronauts. And so I'm looking for what are the commonalities? What are the threads that tie these things together? What is it about January 28th? You have these astronauts die. You have Sir Francis Drake die. Well, then fast forward to 1986, just a little over 33 years ago, and you had the Challenger explosion. Challenger explosion happened on January 28th. So again, same date, another sacrifice or death by fire, death by flame, immolation. And people who've looked into this have, questioned whether this was a real death and explosion or staged. But my point is, the public witnessed an immolation. It was a burnt sacrifice. So it seems to me that this is all symbolic and that fire is a huge part of it. So then the first man in space, according to the stories we're given, Yuri Gagarin, Soviet Air Force pilot, cosmonaut, first human to journey in outer space, achieving the first milestone in the space race. And this was in 1961. Now, he died in March of 68 in an unexplained fiery crash. A mysterious crash took his life. So, of course, first man in space burns, and they're preparing to go to the moon. These guys burn. Then, of course, we're getting acclimated to low Earth orbit, and the Challenger blows up. So it seems that at every stage of the way, as we advance into this new age, we have these sacrifices. We have these symbolic foundational sacrifices from Yuri to Challenger. It's been 33 years since the Challenger explosion, and we're about to move from low Earth orbit into lunar and Mars colonization, which leads me to think, and this is something of a prediction, that to be consistent, that they're probably going to do something similar very soon. And I suspected the space station would burn. That's been kind of a guess of mine. Now, of course, everything they do is 100% symbolic. Like even now, there's a mission to the moon that they're planning right now. NASA's initiative to put a woman on the moon is named Artemis. So Artemis is a goddess name. 13 women, while 13 is very significant to the moon, 13 lunar months. Artemis is the Greek goddess of hunting. And of course, they announced that on May 13th, 2019. And this is all very significant. And now more recently, meet NASA's first astronauts of the Artemis program. And you have, and this is a program to put women on the moon right away, but you can see the class here. For some reason, they call them turtles. I believe there's 13 of them. Now, of course, they probably don't know. I mean, who knows? They could all be dupes. They could all be insiders. But my point is, this is the state church, and these are your altar boys and altar girls at this stage. And they're going into the seminary school where they're going to learn the secrets. Wade says, like cornerstone, which is used to contain the animal sacrifices before the construction. Well, that's kind of where I was looking at these initially. I'm looking at these deaths. So you have the death before the first mission to outer space or to the moon. Then you have an explosion before the next phase and so on. And to me, these are all foundational sacrifices, like milestones. So I'm thinking we had the milestone of the Challenger explosion, because it was, now we're moving into occupying low Earth orbit. This, and of course, when the people die symbolically and they're reborn, they're playing the role of the sun god. Every single Mason in their third degree plays the role of a character who dies and is reborn, raised back from the dead, raised from the dead. And this resurrection is symbolic of Osiris, or even raised. The word raised, as they say, like when you're third degree, they say you're raised. It sounds like the word R-A-Z-E-D, like burned, like the phoenix. And the Masons themselves are based on the Templars, the founder of which was burned at the stake. And then they went underground and they came back. So the idea of these dying and resurrecting or these burnt offerings, and they come back. This is all part of this religion of recycling, resurrection, immortality. So here you have Yuri Gagarin, who I presume would have been a death faker, given that what we're looking at here is this theatrical production long term. But now look at this. I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular one because all of these NASA tragedies appear to be somewhat fishy, suspect, fake. And in this case, the death of Yuri Gagarin has been called into question based on his striking resemblance to Neil Armstrong. Doppelganger level similarities. So he died to his old character and he came back. So the first man to go in space is ostensibly the first man to walk on the moon. They effected the change when he was still young. You saw Neil age, but they didn't have to do very much cosmetically. And it says here, they're still, look at this, the circumstances surrounding the death of the first man in space who died in a jet crash have been clouded in theories and rumors. Another enigmatic death hoax. And look at this here. This is how you know it's based on Osiris. So he crashed. His MiG rammed the ground with enormous force. It says here, the searchers located the fuselage, but the rest of the day was spent recovering body parts from the crash site. Small pieces were collected and placed in a bowl. Anyway, walking around picking up his body parts. Again, I talked about Frankenstein. I talked about Osiris, this idea that the sun god is dismembered and then he's reassembled and he's resurrected. So what I'm suggesting here is that his death was purely symbolic and they brought him back as Neil. And again, the pictures are pretty self-evident. If you care to look into this particular tangent, there's a lot more to back it up. My point is, this has all been ritual theater from day one. And it's not far-fetched. There are 5 million Masons in America. Every third-degree Mason has been symbolically killed, dismembered, and resurrected. It's the same story. Or you're destroyed or dismembered to your old self, and then you're re-put together, reconstituted. So you enter the lodge as a rough stone. You exit as a polished brick, perfected, fit to be laid up in the temple as part of the edifice, for this one world order. You're fashioned into a new piece. So he was made into a character to fit a role. And then he was rebooted after his symbolic death, his immolation, and of course, his rebirth. Okay, so let's continue. So this is the chapter, the symbolism of NASA and the birth of the new age. So Bill Cooper was one of the first ones to point out that space travel was really just allegory. A lot of people have talked about this idea that the moon landing was faked for various reasons. Usually it's just to trick the Russians. But the idea of space travel being totally a hoax isn't so widely discussed. Usually people will say, well, no, it's not hoaxed. It's actually, they had to fake the moon landing because we got a secret space program. They always say it's something more. So anyway, this is from William Cooper himself. And what he says here is that Apollo's mission was just covered in Masonic symbols. So here he says here, NASA was created to make interstellar travel believable. The Apollo program foisted the idea that man could travel to and walk on the moon. Every Apollo mission was carefully rehearsed and filmed in large sound stages at the Atomic Energy Commission's top secret test site in the Nevada desert. Secured and guarded soundstage at the Walt Disney Studios, within which was a huge scale mock-up of the moon. All the names, missions, landing sites, and events echoed occult metaphors, rituals, and symbology. The most transparent was the faked explosion on the spacecraft Apollo 13 named Aquarius. Aquarius is the New Age. At 1:13 or 1313 military time on April 13th, this is a metaphor for the initiation ceremony involving the death, which is the explosion, the placement in the coffin, the period of uncertainty of their survival, communion with the spiritual world, and the imparting of knowledge to the candidate, which is played out here in the orbit and observation of the moon without physical contact, and the rebirth of the initiate, and the raising up of the phoenix of the new age of Aquarius. 13 is the occult number of death and rebirth, reincarnation, sacrifice. Christ, a perfected soul imprisoned in matter. Now, this is an interesting one here. So the idea of being imprisoned in matter, this may tie into the number 33. Christ dies at 33, and I'm thinking, well, Masons have 33 degrees. What does that mean? It could mean this. Ice becomes liquid at 33 degrees, a state change. Like a frozen into liquid, or a soul imprisoned in matter, now liberated, the transcendence. So this is the transition from the old to the new. Another revelation to those who understand the symbolic language of the Illuminati is the meaning of the space shuttles. And of course, this is Bill Cooper. A Colombian enterprise to endeavor for the discovery of Atlantis, and challengers shall be destroyed. Interesting. Now, of course, the Challenger being destroyed is also the story of the sun god. The sun god is always destroyed, and then he's reborn. However he is. Like Luke is a sun god, his Challenger. And of course, having his hand chopped off, the sword hand chopped off, he's destroyed. And then, of course, he's reattached, but it's an eternal myth. Okay, so let's go on. I'm looking mostly at the symbolism here for the launches. That's the part what I wanted to discuss. Okay, here we go. C. Fred Kleinecht, head of the NASA at the time of the Apollo space program, is now the sovereign grand commander of the Council of the 33rd degree of the ancient accepted Scottish rite of Freemasonry. It was his reward for pulling it off, and all the astronauts were Freemasons. There is a photograph on the House of the Temple in D.C. of Neil Armstrong, supposedly on the moon's surface in a spacesuit with a Masonic apron. Recent revelations of the fraudulent nature of NASA and the Apollo space program by the intelligence services have resulted in a flood of propaganda designed to keep the sheeple trapped. The most ambitious are Apollo 13 and From Earth to the Moon, involving actor-producer Tom Hanks, who has a monologue as he walks forward, revealing a huge representation of the god Apollo, aka Osiris or the sun. Okay, so let's move on. This is, again, just talking about how, from the very beginning, and there's much more to it, but from the very beginning, there is a symbolic import to everything, a Masonic import. Even the first step, when a Mason is initiated, they're made to the first step, which is a symbolic step forward, and it represents their first step as a Mason, as a new man, now working with the Masons. And the first step on the moon is just such a symbol. Okay, now I want to talk a bit here about Thelema and how it pertains to this whole program, because the thing is, I was looking at these rockets and I was looking at the names and I was like, why are they naming all of these rockets after dead gods? Why are they naming them after these missions? Even the term mission, why does it have this like religious connotation? So the Thelema was it's a Greek word that means to will or the will, but basically this is the New Age religion. It's Western esotericism. It's considered to be an Egyptian mystery school. It was developed by Aleister Crowley, and he was a ceremonial magician who believed that he was a prophet of the Aeon of Horus. So the Aeon of Horus is the age that we're in. Horus is Mars, and he believed he was here as a prophet. And this is the basis of the New Age movement. And what they are working on, the initiates, is transitioning us into the New Age, into this Martian age or this new Thelemic age. It's another paradise. So Aleister Crowley came to this by divine revelation. Supposedly, Horus spoke to him personally, or he had some type of a revelation. And over the course of 3 days, he dictated Book of the Law. And this has an interesting parallel to L. Ron Hubbard, which we'll get into shortly, who dictated his Dianetics in the same way, like 3-day Coke binge. So this book contains 3 chapters that were alleged to be written down in 1 hour beginning at noon on April 8th, 9th, and 10th in Cairo, Egypt. So this started when he's walking through a museum and he sees this, the Stele of Revealing. So it's a plaque, and it's like the 666th one. And when he saw this, he believed it had some type of a special message for him. He also believed that this was what was pointing him, towards his destiny as of being this prophet of the New Age or whatever. And you have here Horus on a throne. You have the goddess of the night sky arched above. And this is Thoth communicating to the initiate the story of the New Age. And that's what he's basically describing. So the Book of the Law itself is a little red book which is given to the initiates when they get into the club. And so I joined this group out of for a few reasons. Mostly it was curiosity. I was in the military, and a lot of my friends were Masons, and I was fascinated by the symbolism. I didn't know what it meant. It was big where I went. I was stationed for a bit in El Paso. So one day I walked into a Masonic lodge there. They had these 2 sphinxes out in front, and I took a look around. They gave me a tour. The library had a huge collection of books on psychic phenomenon, magic, and then a section of Smithsonian and National Geographic. The old building had an elevator, lodges on the 2nd floor. And like I said, they gave me a tour. So I was very much interested in this topic. Like I said, many of my friends were already in the military, were in this club. And I was just like wondering how much of it was actually esoteric. But I found it to be very much, dry compared to the more openly New Age stuff. But there were certain parallels. So I picked up this book, Book of the Law, which is claimed to be, like I said, a dictated book. Crowley supposedly channeled it. So I look into this group, and one day I find a little recruiting platform pamphlet. It said OTO. So I called the number, and they met me at a cafe, and I was met by 2 people, and they basically described, hey, look, we believe that we are transitioning into the age of Horus out of the age of Osiris. They said that we had this matriarchal age, then a patriarchal age, and now we're moving into the age of the androgen. So they gave me a list of books to look at or to read, and it was sort of a preliminary interview. Well, I had already read most of the books they had referenced, and so then I scheduled to learn more. And here's what happened is they had me meet them at a certain place at a certain time. It was a post office, and there were 2 other people there also, parked on the same side of the post office. We were all instructed to meet there. And the representative from the Thelema, it was called the Abbey. The representative came in a van, and we were all pretty much in an unmarked van, no windows, listening to some type of new agey music. Dead Can Dance or something. Anyway, we went up to this mansion out in the mountains where they had their whole temple. It was basically a Thelemic temple private property, large piece of land. It had a miniature Stonehenge. It had a biosphere. And the biosphere was for the people who are really serious, who are willing to take up to 6 months out of their life to go live in solitude and perform what they called the invocation of the higher guardian angel or holy guardian angel. Anyway, the initiation was pretty much what you would expect. It is all set up like Egyptian. Masonry is pretty much like, as you've seen in the pictures, suits and ties, checker floors. But the Thelemic Lodge was all Egyptian. Costumes, dressed up. Everyone had these very elaborate. I mean, there's a lot of money that goes into these things. You do the whole cross my heart, hope to die type oaths, that you never spill the secrets or whatever. And for me, it was always just about getting the information. But the very first thing they had me do was I'm in the attic with these two other people, and they had us put on just a white robe, which we had to actually sew it. It was like this, and we had to repeat this mantra. I mean, it's this long process where you're sitting in an attic sewing a robe, and then you read the book of the law cover to cover before you're taken down into the initiation chambers. And what they do is they come in the room one by one, and they put they come after the initiates one after another. They put a hood over your head and a rope around your neck. And so I'm being walked down a staircase by these individuals with like Middle Eastern garb and turbans and swords. They have the scimitars. They put a hood over my head and a rope around my neck. And I'm walked down this staircase into the place where we have our initiation ceremony. So anyway, fast forward, not to get too much into this, but my point is, this is how all of the secret societies are structured. They all have these rights, and then they have degrees, and every person at a degree is sworn to secrecy, to what they've learned, and they can't talk to the people above them or the people above them. So I only went in at the basic level, and I met some of the people from the higher levels, but it was definitely stratified. So this is the basis of secret societies. It doesn't matter about the mumbo jumbo that they teach. Ultimately, it's about a hierarchy with security clearances. It's about compartmentalization. So what is the difference between a blood oath and a non-disclosure agreement? Nothing. Practically nothing. So I was given a non-disclosure agreement. So I was very familiar with it. I basically raided the library. I didn't really want to go back, and I could go into that later. Really, it wasn't for me. I'm not really a joiner of clubs. It wasn't satanic. There was no animal sacrifice. There's a bunch of vegans. There was no occultism in the sense of like black magic or anything. It was mostly yoga. It was mostly yoga and homesteading. It was basically a cult, and I didn't really want to be a part of a cult. I was mostly interested in what their information was, but they parse it out. They don't tell you what the symbols mean. It's very little by little. But I did learn that they had these rites, and this is kind of why I got out, where they have all the white tents out in the field, and apparently on these overnight events is where you might participate in sex magic. And they said a big part of this, and this is the part that repulsed me, is they said that you had to get over your ego. So if your ego doesn't want you to do someone because you're not attracted to them, you have to get over it. So I was like, whoa, I'm not going to get into a tent with a bunch of weirdo hippies in the mountains. No thanks. No offense, but it wasn't for me. But my point is, I got all the books. I learned about Thelema, Crowley from the source and what they're actually teaching. And I didn't stick around very long. Immediately after, I got involved in Scientology. Again, looking for answers, searching for stuff firsthand, investigating. I've never been one to take secondhand information. So I got involved with Scientology to learn because, of course, I noticed right away the iconography, like what I'm talking about here. So the symbolism, obviously, you see the pyramids. With Scientology, you do have a pyramid that's very prevalent. You have two triangles with the S, and then you have the cross. Well, they don't worship Jesus. Why do they have a cross? So the cross is the Rosicrucian cross. Here's the OTO cross, the thelema or thelemic. So this is the one that we had over there. It's called the rose cross. You have the Hebraic characters. You have the symbols of all the planets. Anyway, this is the same one as Scientology. So I was looking into Scientology as well. I was looking at, to me, these are all facets of the same type of organization. And just like Thelema, Scientology is also ordered into degrees. So instead of a degree, like Masons, you have degrees. Same with Thelema. They have various titles. Well, even with Scientology, you have a degree system. If you're not in it, you're probably an SP or a suppressive person. But when you're in it, it's a numbered degree system. So here you have again the Scientology cross and the Rosicrucian cross are the same. I mean, this is more or less what the Christian cross is based on. It's not like these are ripping off of that. No, it's the other way around. You know, Christianity and Scientology and Thelema are all actually a part of the same thing. They're not like antithetical. It's not like Thelema and Christianity are different. That's the point I'm trying to get across here. If you're a New Ager, a Wiccan, or a Christian, or a secular atheist who believes we're going to Mars, you're part of the same paradigm. Okay, so I started making these connections, and it was around this time that I started noticing this philosophy of Gnosticism, and this is when I started picking up on the symbolism in movies, showing that the initiates of this system are heavily involved in the entertainment industry and in propagating their messages to everyone. So this is a movie called Vanilla Sky. Tom Cruise, Scientologist, and it is more or less a Gnostic retelling. So the basic storyline is this. You have this rich guy who owns a magazine called Rise. Very significant. We're talking about the risen savior. So he works for a magazine called Rise, and he's in a big, it's a skyscraper he works in, and his name's David, which of course has some connections here as far as symbolism go, names, the Davidic line or something, but David Ames is 33 years old when he is killed. Basically, his girlfriend commits suicide with him in the car. Now, he dies when they go off the bridge, but then he goes into a simulation because he's so rich, he bought himself an insurance policy called life extension, where when he dies, he's put into freezing, into cryogenic hold, and then his mind goes into its own world. So this 33-year-old dies, and they have a 3-day funeral at his house. And so after the 3-day funeral at his house, this is where it gets weird. That's like where he picks up. So his illusion or his virtual reality life picks up right after that. So it's like he's been reborn after 3 days. Anyway, Jesus dies on the 3rd day. He rises again, 33 years old. Now, when he wakes up because this woman is standing above him. He met her at a bar. Her name is Sophia. I mentioned Sophia before, the goddess of wisdom, the Gnostic goddess. So Sophia wakes up or raises him from the dead. Well, Sophia is just another name for the goddess who raises the god from the dead. So the sky goddess, the god, Isis, Osiris. So it's just another version of Isis. And so she resurrects him. And it's called Rise, again, is his magazine. So Vanilla Sky is about Gnosticism and this Gnostic Christ who, through his girlfriend Sophia, whatever, he recognizes that he's a god and he's a creator of his own universe. And then the movie ends with him jumping off this building, conquering his fear of heights. Now, of course, he talks about his dad early on in the movie, who wrote a book called The Kingdom. And the kingdom is in the Kabbalistic tree of life. That's what they call the earth. So, there's quite a lot in this movie to unpack, but mainly it's just that here you have the most famous Scientologist in a movie that has the Gnostic myth encoded into it, which you wouldn't know unless you were an initiate, unless you knew what 33 meant, unless you knew who Sophia was. So when I saw this after having, researched a lot of these things, I'm like, okay, well, it's another example of popular movies with occult messages, occult meaning. And again, Scientology is another. Well, let's look at L. Ron Hubbard really quick. We'll get into this. American author of science fiction and founder of the Church of Scientology. Again, science fiction and science, what I'm saying is that science fiction is what they've been using, and you can all see this now, for generations now, to prepare people for fake science in the news. But here you have a very famous science fiction writer who then creates this religion. So here's where he ties into the story. So I had experience, as I said, with Scientology and with Thelema. I recognize a common system, a common origin. And here we have this bizarre intersection between Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. So let's get into Jack Parsons really quick first, too. So here you have a rocket engineer, Marvel Whiteside Parsons, American rocket engineer, chemist, and Thelemite occultist associated with Caltech. He was the principal founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He invented the first rocket engine to use castable composite rocket propellant and pioneered the advancement of liquid fuel and solid fuel rockets. So here you have someone who is both a rocket scientist and a foundational member of JPL, also a communist, which is noteworthy. He's a Marxist. So I'm telling you, the communists knew the space program. They used the space program and environmentalism to really bring this about, this fundamental change in our worldview. So after communism, he got involved in Thelema. Now, if you look at the Thelemic book, it's a little red book. It almost looks identical to the red book of the communists, or the IPCC's red book, which is the environmentalist book. All these little red books, and they all have the same message: wipe out the present order and bring about a new. And the book of the law that I referenced does talk about bathing the world in blood 3 times in order to prepare it for the new age. Okay, so he has some published works. He was pretty much the American equivalent of Aleister Crowley in terms of his rank or importance. In 1941, he joined the Agape Lodge, a branch of the OTO, and at Crowley's bidding, he replaced its leader in 1942. In 1945, he conducted the Babylon working with L. Ron Hubbard to invoke the Thelemic goddess Babylon to Earth. He continued the procedure with Marjorie Cameron, who Parsons married in 1946. So let's move on to this. So we're looking at Jack Parsons, head of the OTO in America, foundational member of Caltech, engaging in something called the Babylon working with L. Ron Hubbard. So the Babylon working was a series of rituals performed in 1946 by Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. It was to manifest the incarnation of an archetypal divine feminine. So the archetypal divine feminine would be Isis, would be Sophia, would be Babylon in the New Age. So Parsons declared that the first series of rituals was complete and successful. Right afterwards, he met Marjorie Cameron and regarded her as having been summoned. So Marjorie Cameron was a red-haired woman. Marjorie Cameron Parsons Kimmel. Her last name is Kimmel. That's interesting. Out there, and I wonder if she's related to Jimmy Kimmel. Jimmy Kimmel, that Tonight Show, is at a Masonic lodge. Okay, she was in the Navy, then she met Parsons. engaged in sex magic rituals called the Babylon Working. She married Jack Parsons until, let's see, then he exploded in a death at their house. Yeah, this is his wife, and she shows up later as well, and I'll get back to her in a minute. The long and short of it is this. Hubbard and Jack Parsons and this woman pretty much had like a three-way relationship, and there was a lot of uh, sex magic involved, where they were attempting to simultaneously conceive a child in this woman and summon some entity into the womb. So a way of augmenting or replacing the human soul with something higher. They called this occult eugenics. They called it the Babylon Working. Some say they were trying to invoke the Antichrist, but they were trying to create a moon child. And again, this is the idea that you can create a special child, a magical child, a genius of some sort through this special form of, I guess, sacred sex, or sex done in conjunction with astrology and with ritual observations. Now, why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because Jack Parsons, being an occultist, being where he is at NASA, associating with a sci-fi author who later starts a branch of the Rosicrucians, probably the most successful. I mean, you can laugh all you want at Scientology, but it is one of the most powerful branches of Rosicrucianism. People don't fear it for no reason, despite the outward appearance of it. I mean, at its very core, what is Scientology? And it's Catholicism. It's Mystery Babylon. The very idea of engrams, which are their concept of sin, the very concept of confession, where you're expiating yourself of your sins, has been reinvented for Scientology with the e-meter. So with Scientology, you have a room where you sit with your auditor, just kind of like sitting in a confession booth, and you tell your auditor all the bad things that have happened that might explain why your tone is so low, why you're not a fully operational, high on the tone scale person. And so you hold this device, it's called an e-meter, and it's supposed to detect charges when you're releasing charges, when you're releasing engrams or knots, like blockages in your past. And so in a way, it's like getting your sins forgiven, having your conscience expiated, walking away feeling lighter. Well, they do this with Scientology, and it could just be the e-meters electrocuting you, but they reinvented it. The entire system, even the Inquisition, even the idea of castigating the non-believers and then diagnosing them as suppressive, and then there is a whole lot of paranoia built into it. But ultimately, it is in fact a secret society that's been dressed up, and this is where I think L. Ron Hubbard is important. So you had this science fiction writer tasked with taking Mystery Babylon and making it science fiction-y. That's what it looks like. So there's this thing called the Hymn to Pan. Now, Pan, of course, is another god of the, the paganism, but it's another god of the earth, like a fertility god. Pan is usually walking around, like, the satyr. Pan means everything, means all. Even the term panspermia, which is the term they use to describe how life has propagated across the universe. They say, well, it was propagated across the universe through chunks of ice, through asteroids, through comets, and it lands in other places. It landed on Earth. So the Earth got like inseminated, right? So the idea of populating another world by sending an obelisk full of people who can then reproduce, in a way, that's like panspermia. Well, of course, Pan is another phallic god represented by an obelisk. So what you have here, interestingly enough, is Aleister Crowley had this thing called the Hymn to Pan. And whenever Jack Parsons would watch one of his burning obelisks, when he would attend one of these launches, it was said that he would recite the Hymn to Pan. that he had made it into a ritual, more or less. So it seems a little kooky. Look, Parsons started to develop an interest in magic and the supernatural. He had meetings at the OTO. At these gatherings he took place, he noticed something called the Gnostic Mass, which is a weird take on the Catholic Mass. Now, correction here, because this is from Vice. The Gnostic Mass is how it's actually practiced. The Gnostic Mass is the unocculted version of it. So, for example, you go to church if you're a Catholic and you have the communion bread and the wine, and it represents the flesh and blood of Christ. Well, no, that's what they give you. They give you the story of cannibalism because for some reason cannibalism is a little more palatable than the esoteric meaning. It's not the flesh of Christ and his blood. It's the blood of the goddess and it's the seed of the male. And it's a reference to the menstrual blood. So again, it's a fertility rite. The altar, the church, that's the womb. The altar is where the consummation is happening. So in the mouth of the priest, he's got the seed, he's got the wine. That represents the conception. He's right there at the bottom of the cross. And this is the conception, of course. So yes, there is symbolically, it's a fertility rite at its core. So when the Thelemites practice it, and I didn't stick around long enough for this. When they practice this rite, they have something called the cakes of light, which is basically communion wafers with, quote, light. And of course, light is allegory for the sun. Light is, the light of the sun is allegory for the seed or for life, the force of life, or even the male seed. So it's like, in other words, you're looking at a fertility rite practiced in front of everybody. But in the OTO, they do it openly, where they actually know what they're eating and they know what's in the wine. And that's only in the publicly celebrated Gnostic Mass, where it's all just dramatized. They actually do it, as you would expect, the idea of witchcraft and orgies and sex magic, or group sex. And usually it's not like everybody. Usually it's just the priest and the priestess in the middle. So if you were a Wiccan and you were celebrating the rites throughout the year, like, for example, Halloween or Walpurgis Nacht, or even the Christmas rites, there would, like, for example, when they celebrate Saturnalia, the high priest and the priestess will have sex in front of everybody. Like, this is how they do it. But in church on Sundays, it's all occulted because nobody would stand for it. So Parsons was engaged in the Gnostic Mass. It says here, on a black and white stage stood an altar with hieroglyphic patterns, an upright coffin, out of which the group's leader would appear. Poetry was read, swords were drawn, breasts were kissed. It was a highly charged sexual atmosphere. Wine was drunk, and cakes made out of menstrual blood were consumed. It was here that Crowley's philosophy was propounded. Do what thou wilt. Now it goes on here, talking about Parsons, and he belonged to the Suicide Squad. That's what they were called, because what they were doing was so dangerous. Parsons' incipient occultism was kooky, as communism was the preferred diversion of most of the Caltech students. But it did not prevent them from recognizing his genius at manufacturing rocket fuels. At the testing grounds, Parsons would chant Aleister Crowley's Hymn to Pan prior to igniting the rockets, and the scorching flames and explosions added an infernal backdrop to the supernatural. Now, of course, here you have Aleister Crowley in his ritual garb. And see, look, it's a cross. It's not a pentagram. What I'm trying to get people to see here, too, is that it's not about God versus Satan or the church versus the devil. No, the church is an extension of the same universal religion. Listen to this here. This is from Vice. Think about that for 1 second. The top mind driving America's early rocket program, the program that fueled the space race and the Cold War, was the lead figure in the world of the occult. By day, he built rockets for the government. By night, he emerged from a coffin to perform sex magic with his followers. Now, again, do you think anything's changed? I bring this up because we see the exoteric, we see what they do on the outside. Space sex literally is that. I mean, space X is space sex, heaven sex, sex magic. It's all allegory. So they may not understand, like to many, they'll say, well, Jack was a bit of an eccentric, and that's why he was into that. Well, no, between Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, they had everything they needed. He could say, hey, look, I'm in the OTO, I'm the head of the OTO. How do we take this and dress it up for the new age? And then you have, of course, L. Ron Hubbard, science fiction writer. He was able to reinterpret the symbols for the new age, which is what they've done. So Scientology is just Rosicrucianism or Freemasonry by another name. It's OTO by another name.